Good evening, everybody. My name is Josh Zakum. I'm the District 8 City Councilor and Chair of the City Council's Special Committee on Civil Rights. And today we are holding a hearing on docket number 1061, order for a hearing regarding voter registration in the City of Boston. The intent of this hearing, as I've mentioned to a couple of the folks here, is essentially a public brainstorming session with some of the relevant city departments, obviously members of the public, advocates, and voters around the city, to look at ways that we can, through legislation, whether it's through municipal ordinance or policy at the city level, home rule petition to the legislature, make it easier, safer, more convenient, more secure for people to vote in the City of Boston. Since we filed this hearing order, I've heard from numerous people, both in the organized advocacy community and individuals, with suggestions, with comments. Particularly, I heard recently from some folks who work the polls, who've asked about ways that they could access early voting and what we can do about that. So this is something that, I think in the interest of our democracy, in the interest of good government, we want to encourage and make it as easy as possible for people to exercise their right to vote. It's, in my opinion, the fundamental right that protects our other fundamental rights, and we need to make sure that in the City of Boston, and I certainly hope ultimately the Commonwealth, we're doing everything we can. We're lucky in Massachusetts that we are not facing organized efforts to disenfranchise our voters, as some states across the country are doing, but we can certainly do better. I think when we see that some of our fellow, our neighboring states, even New Hampshire, that has same-day voter registration, and other measures that make it easier for people to vote and exercise their franchise, we should be doing that as well. Boston being the birthplace of American democracy, City Council's been holding our meetings in Faneuil Hall, surrounded by the spirits of our founders. We need to do everything we can on this issue. So before I go on and on about why I think this is so important, I want to just outline a little bit about what we're having. It's going to happen tonight. We have our esteemed Council Technology Manager, Kerry Jordan, in the back there, who's videotaping this, so everything is going to be recorded. This is not going out live, right, because we are off-site, but it will be posted on the Council website and accessible for your viewing pleasure anytime. And we're going to start off with representatives of some of the city departments, and as given our unique setup here, we're going to ask folks who are speaking to go up to this wooden podium. We've got a microphone right there, and we'll start, like I said, with the administration folks. We have some people who have checked in and said they would like to testify. I will work my way through that list as we move on, and I will now look to see, almost forgot. A couple of my colleagues who have sent their letters that they are unable to be here. Our Councilor Asabi George writes that Dear Councilor Zakum, I sincerely apologize for not being able to attend this hearing tonight on docket 1061, voter registration in the City of Boston. I have a long-standing scheduling conflict. I look forward to reviewing this hearing in its entirety and being an active participant in future conversations. Thank you, Councilor Asabi George. And from Councilor Ayanna Presley, I regret that due to a long-standing commitment to MC the Victims' Rights Law Center Gala, I will not be able to attend this evening's Special Committee on Civil Rights hearing regarding registration in the City of Boston. Access to the voting booth is a fundamental right, and I want to commend you for ordering this hearing. I look forward to working with you to ensure our political process is inclusive and representative of those it serves. I will review the recording of this hearing. So from two of my at-large colleagues who clearly I think are interested, and as many of my other colleagues who co-sponsored this order when we entered it. So having said that, I'm now going to turn it over to the administration representatives who have set their own order, but as you would like, just come on up. If you have an opening statement, deliver it, please state your name, affiliation, and then I may or may not have some questions after these statements. Commissioner?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Councilor Zakum, for holding this hearing. My name is Dion Irish. I'm the Commissioner of the City of Boston's Election Department, and it gives me great pleasure to be here today to talk about a subject that's very near and dear to the Election Department and the City's Board of Election Commissioners. We see our role as not just administrators of the election and holding clean elections that are with polling places that are accessible, but we also see ourselves as having a role in doing whatever we can or offering whatever input we can provide in ensuring that there is access to the ballot and ease of access to voter registration and all things related to that. I know that Mayor Walsh is also it's also very important to Mayor Walsh. In fact, recently Mayor Walsh worked on some legislation that was filed at the State House by Senator Boncourt and Representative Carvalho, which was regarding same-day registration, albeit in somewhat of a limited basis. That particular legislation is advocating for same-day registration for first-time registrants and folks who have not been previously registered in the city of Boston or in the state of Massachusetts. It doesn't get us all the way that folks are looking for in terms of having everyone's the ability to register on the same day, but we also understand that sometimes incremental change is important in demonstrating that we can actually go further. But we're open to going as far as we can go, as long as we are able to have the security necessary and the ability and the resources in place to make same-day or automatic voter registration available. So I'm very much interested in hearing the conversation today and exploring the ideas and the potential sources of information that we could use to make it easier to vote, because the fact of the matter is, if you're a United States citizen, you're over the age of 18, you're eligible to vote. So if there are things that we can do to make that easier and be able to focus more attention or focus on voter engagement and actually getting people out to the polls, I think it's something that's in all of our best interest. So I think with that, I'll wrap up my opening statement, and also just want to add that I brought Sabino Pamonti, our head registrar. He's here with me. He's truly an expert in all things election related, so I don't think that there's a question that you'll be able to ask us tonight that we can't answer.
Thank you, Commissioner. I do have just a couple questions. What's the current status of the 20-day registration deadline? I know it had been halted for a time by the Superior Court. Is that currently in place? People need to register 20 days before the election?
Yes, the registration, 20-day registration deadline was challenged, and court ruled that it was not constitutional. Some of the information that was used in that case came from the city of Boston. We gave them some figures. I'll roughly estimate that in the period after the deadline for the 2016 presidential election, we had approximately 1,500 people who registered after that deadline, and up to Election Day, that theoretically would have been able to participate if we didn't have that deadline or if we had same-day registration. So we are following that case closely. The decision has been appealed by the state, so the current 20-day deadline will remain in place until there's ultimate resolution to whether or not there will be a deadline or what that deadline would be if there is one. But I do want to take advantage of that question just to emphasize that whatever decisions we make, we should be cognizant that we are a part of a statewide system, and so we definitely would not be in favor of anything that's only for the city of Boston. It needs to be uniform across the state, because we do administer state and federal elections as well.
So we just had a local election on Tuesday, and this is no reflection on you or your department, but obviously turnout was pretty low, significantly lower than it had been 4 years ago. Can you just tell us what was the turnout percentage citywide, roughly?
It was about 86% less than what we prepared for.
Okay. And you always prepare for 100%, right?
We always prepare for 100% plus.
So, I think that's something, I think this is a very timely discussion to have, because, we did have this election, 14.5% turnout. And to some degree that, I don't know that same-day registration would make a huge difference, but it makes a difference for some people. I do know that folks who are out, I heard from campaign volunteers that they were calling people, or that they would encounter people on the street who said, I didn't realize it was today, I would love to vote, I don't think I'm registered, I just moved, et cetera, et cetera. So there's certainly room there. We're also going to be hearing from some of the other city departments, but on ways they can, as our public-facing agents engage with potential voters and register them. Right now, when someone wants to register to vote, obviously they mail in their form, they can come in person to City Hall. What sort of staffing changes do you think you would need to make, or technology changes? One, to administer a same-day system, and two, as we get more into some of the other departments, say for transportation, if someone's getting their resident parking permit, and that then becomes now you're registered to vote, what we need to see to make that work in the interface between the departments?
So with respect to the same-day registration, it would depend on what type of same-day registration system we'd be putting into place. I've seen a variety of different ways that it's implemented in different states, so it would really depend on how we're doing it. In some states, folks have voting provisionally and it's researched before it's counted. In other states, you're required to complete some forms and affidavits and provide some information, and you are able to have your vote count on that day. So, you know, for the latter scenario, is you need to have good security. You want to have the technology in place to be able to verify that someone hasn't voted already at another location and things of that sort to ensure the integrity of the election. So, you know, just to sort of answer that broadly, it would depend on what we ultimately would want to have in place as a system, and every system that you develop does have upsides and downsides. If we're interconnected at our 255 precincts, then that may also potentially open us up to more cyber threats and things of that nature. So the other part of your question was?
It's about, you know, if we come out and say, at the end of this process, if, you know, say the transportation department is now, if you're getting a resident permit, you know, and it includes, you know, proof of citizenship of some kind, and that now we want to say, all right, you're registered to vote. I mean, would that be, what technologically would they need to do? Is that something that your current staff could just get a report, you know, at the end of every day or every week and do, or are we looking at big technology changes? Do you have any idea maybe what other places do in that scenario?
So, I mean, I think a good example is the relationship we have now with the Registry of Motor Vehicles, where when someone goes there to do a transaction, and you know, they're providing all the necessary information that we need for voter registration, and so that's being used now, and we're seeing that happen more and more often. I think it's almost like 8-to-1 now in terms of transactions we're getting electronically through the RMV and through online registration, compared to mail-in forms or paper forms. So, yeah. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
That's all right. And then currently, what sort of documentation is required to register to vote? A proof of citizenship, residency, ID? What do we require right now?
Proof of citizenship, proof of residency, and you know, suitable identification. If you're filling out a form now, you can give us a driver's license number, or you can give us social security number information. So that's verified to ensure that you are who you are
and as far as
where you live.
Proof of citizenship, is that a social security, birth certificate, a passport, any of the above, or are there other?
It's an oath. You know, there are two parts on the registration form that you need to complete. You need to check it off. You need to also sign under under pains and penalties of perjury that you are a citizen. So, you know, there are potentially other sources of information that would be acceptable for the purposes of voter registration. But again, I would say that it would need to be a uniform practice across the Commonwealth in order for us to be able to accept those forms of information.
And then, well, this will be, I think, my last question for you right now, Commissioner. You know, I think we really, you and your team successfully implemented early voting for the presidential election this year across the city. What do you think it would take to do that in our, you know, every 2-year state elections, or obviously our municipal elections? I know there is a cost associated with it. Do you see that as a way to increase turnout and make it easier for people to vote? And would you think that would be successful in those two other scenarios, both local elections and state elections?
I would say the latter. I think early voting seems to make it easier. Definitely makes it easier. I'm not sure if it brought out any additional people, but making it easier is important. We have it's a short window of time when you think about it that folks have to vote. If you're working, it depends on your hours, you're trying to get your vote in before you go to work or after, in the traffic that we're experiencing now in the city of Boston. It doesn't make it easy for folks to be able to exercise their rights. So if there are things that we can do to make it easier, early voting is one thing, but I think there are other things that we can look at. You mentioned a poll worker talked to you about early voting. We've gotten a lot of feedback from our poll workers. We have about almost 2,000 poll workers who are working all day on election day from 6 in the morning until closing. They're not always, most often they're not at their own precinct, so they do need to be able to vote. And they'd love to see the absentee process expanded, for example, to allow that category of folks who are giving back to our democracy in our community to be able to vote before Election Day. So I think there are a lot of the conversations we can have and things that we can explore that can make it easier for folks to participate, because getting it all done on one day on Tuesday it is very challenging. I'll use my mother as an example. She lives in Mattapan, Hyde Park line, and she works at Children's Hospital. Because of her shift, she cannot vote before work, and every election day it's a challenge for her to get to the polling place by 8 p.m. And she makes it there, but it's a challenge.
And then one other question. You obviously mentioned that the RMV takes a lot of registration information and gets it to you. Are there other agencies at the city or state level that currently do that? Or is the RMV the only one that you have that interface with?
The Secretary of State's office as well.
And is that all electronic, like updated daily, that sort of thing?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So that's something that I think, obviously, if we have other agencies that have the required information, would be relatively simple to implement that sort of thing, right?
Yes, definitely, it's doable.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Hey, David, I guess you're next. I'm gonna rely on you all to keep your order and just come up when you're ready.
Good evening, Councillor. My name is David Leonard, President of the Boston Public Library. I'm very happy to be here and participate in this process. The Boston Public Library's mission includes a mission of civic engagement, and so to the extent that our core functions support this process, we're happy to be part of a conversation about how to improve participation. Traditionally, sometimes that's about making some of our locations available as polling places, but to the extent that increases in voter registration or increase in turnout further drive our ability to meet our mission of civic engagement, we're very supportive of that. I was particularly asked to speak as one of the city agencies where there is a registration interaction with members of the public, and just to address how that works. To be a patron of the Boston Public Library, to be a full patron, you are a resident, you go to school, you work or own property in the state of Massachusetts. So it is beyond Boston, and we do have a mission to serve the Commonwealth. To date, our registration process only records the minimum amount of information needed to meet the eligibility requirements. And that requires showing a photo ID, and there are some alternate mechanisms with say a lease or other form of ID that's acceptable. So that's really the main interaction where we as a city agency have an opportunity to interact with the public that involves registration.
Thank you. Certainly, I think I voted at the Copley branch of the public library on Tuesday. It's been my home polling location for some time, and being able to use the facilities are, I think, hugely important for people to vote. And obviously, through the civic engagement, through the work that your teams do, the librarians and the branches, education and civic engagement is incredibly important. And appreciate you being here and participating in this process. I guess a couple questions spring to mind. One would be including a voter registration option when people are getting their library cards, even as simple as saying, here is the form, or here is where you can go to register online. Is that something that is feasible? What else, what typically happens? It's been a long time since I went and got a library card. So, you come in, you say, I'm here, I want my library card, here's my ID, or here's my utility bill. I mean, so there's some documentation that happens.
So the person wanting to register can pre-populate the information online, but then they still have to come into a branch, any branch of the library, any of either the central library or any of the 24 branches, soon to be hopefully 25 branches, and demonstrate proof of identity there. If they haven't pre-populated the form, then there's a brief interview essentially with one of the library staff members to take that information and input it into the system directly.
Okay. So I guess then the essential question is, well, without adding, excuse me, without adding too much to that process, I mean, I think something as simple, and I don't think this would require any legislative changes, to hand them their voter registration. I mean, particularly if it's someone from the city of Boston, but even if not, I think, you mentioned, and I know especially the central branch, but I know all the branches are a huge resource for people around the state. Is that, is there any sort of packet that's handed to people saying, here's your library information, here's your card?
There isn't today, but I think we'd be very open to exploring, not just for this purpose, but maybe other purposes that make a package of relevant information available to members of the public. I think maybe that's the low-hanging fruit opportunity that we should explore further, and then build on that if there are, other opportunities that should be explored. We would, of course, take our lead from the election department in terms of what other eligibility or requirements need to be explored, just to ensure that that any way that we're participating in the process meets their requirements.
No, I think in an ideal world, people could do the full registration, at the library when they're getting their card. But as you mentioned, low-hanging fruit, providing people with, here's your voter registration information. I think that's something I'd like to explore, and I don't think it would require any legislation. It's so great. Thank you very much, David.
Great. I apologize, I have to leave. I can't stay for the whole hearing.
No, I understand. I'll certainly, the committee will certainly be in touch if we do have additional questions or suggestions, but glad we've identified at least one concrete step we can work on taking together.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you. Now we have either BPS or BTD. Or So you just identify yourself, any affiliation, and whatever statements you would like to make.
Good evening, Councilman Zakem and members of the general public. My name is Monica Roberts. I am the Assistant Superintendent of the Office of Engagement with the Boston Public Schools. The Boston Public Schools is very excited about the work of the Special Committee on Civil Rights around voter registration. We realize we have a lot of access to families as we are working with them and their students, and are very interested in how we might play a role in increasing civic engagement among our families, but also our eligible students. We are very interested in working with the Elections Department to think about and to begin to explore how we might begin to leverage the opportunities within the district to support this effort. I have with me Anthony Pena, who is a senior with Boston Public Schools, but also represents the Boston Student Advisory Council. He has prepared a statement from the student perspective, and so I want to invite him to come and share.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Anthony Pena. I'm a senior at the Mary Line School in Brighton, as well as a BSEC representative, and I'm 18 years old. I'm here on behalf of young people in BPS to share our views on voting registration, as this is a intergenerational civil rights issue. I appreciate the efforts of the city for providing students, much like myself, the opportunity to be more civically engaged, such as the election poll this past Tuesday. many city initiatives have made it a bit easier for younger people to vote. We can now pre-register at the age of 16 or 17. That way, when we turn 18, we are all able to fulfill our civic duty. However, even though we are able to partake in our civic duty as Americans, many BPS students are still not able to vote due to the limitations that are currently in place. Current legislation requires us to register within 20 days in order to participate in an election, and that is an inconvenience to us students, as we students have many obligations to fill, such as homework, sports, projects, works, etc., that sometimes intersect with these elections, and that puts us in positions where we have to decide whether or not we should vote. I am one of those students. Just this week, I had to choose between the commitments I made with others and myself versus the obligations as a U.S. citizen and a Bostonian. As many seniors in BPS, I have to focus on my schoolwork, applying for college, and holding down a job. This issue is important to students because as the future of the city and nation, we need to ensure that voting is accessible to all, and we need to remove any barriers to registering. To this date, BSAC has been involved in this issue by working with Mass Vote to have students in BSAC pre-register before 18, and by supporting the election by working the polls through the student poll workers pilot this year. I spoke with many of my peers on the Boston Student Advisory Council, and here are some recommendations we would like for you to consider. To continue to promote the online registration form, to make voter registration accessible through guidance counselors at school. This is always the first avenue students go to in looking for opportunities. Make sure information is passed at school several times a year with enough time before elections. Work with the BTU teachers, as they are the ones in the classroom, and have them share information with the students. If the schools are doing outreach to students, they should make sure to include our parents and encourage us to have the conversation with our parents as well, and offer community service hours to students for going out to vote and encouraging their peers and doing their own outreach, as this gives an incentive to students to actually do it. In closing, I want to thank you for your time in hearing this matter, as I hope you consider how we can best engage all citizens and simplify the process of registering to vote, not only for students, but for parents and new residents of the city of Boston. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Anthony, thank you for that. I have one question for you real quick. So obviously you did register and you pre-registered, right, when you were under 18?
I was not able to re-register because for some reason there was not information given to us, and that's the case for many of my friends. We were not given that information on how to pre-register, so we had to do our own outreach and go ask people who knew how to register.
So that was going to be my question, is how easy is it to do this pre-registration? So maybe it's easy once you know where to go, but there's nothing when you're a sophomore or a junior?
No, there was no indication on how to pre-register.
Okay. Well, that's certainly something I think we can look at addressing. I think it's phenomenal that people can pre-register, but obviously, like so many, I think, of the resources we have in the city, if people are unaware of it, it doesn't do much good. And are most of your friends who are 18, are they registered to vote, do you think?
So I did speak with some of them before this, and a majority of them are registered, but the problem is there are a few who weren't able to register due to this limitation, and that frustrated them because for the first time and they turned 18, they realized that this is their chance for their voice to be heard and their opinions will now matter on a city level. Yeah. But since they weren't able to register, they feel sort of frustrated because they can't voice their opinions.
Yeah. No, I share that frustration. I think the 20-day cutoff is completely arbitrary. Obviously, the goal would be to have same-day registration to address that. But I'd certainly, Superintendent, I'd like to maybe turn to you a little bit to talk about what we can do on two aspects. On certainly people who are already in the BPS system, probably makes sense, sophomores, juniors, and seniors who are, at the age where they can at least pre-register, if not register. Is there, what is your sense of how we can do that and make it easier? Are there materials that go out at the beginning of every year or at some point in the year that this can be included? What do you think? Obviously know it better than I do what those interactions are. What can we do here?
So I think there are a number of options that we can explore. We have about 40,000 families who come in every year to our welcome centers, and every family walks out with the information packet. I think we can look at whether that is an opportunity to share information If so, in what forms and how that might work. We also provide a lot of workshops and learning opportunities for our families through various offices. And that just might be an opportunity to have a table there where people can get information or register. Obviously, we have to work through what's possible and what's not, but I think there are a lot of opportunities face-to-face where we also can share information. Many of our schools send information home. They have beginning of the year events. I think we could also explore whether it's possible to do some of this work through schools. And as Mr. Pena so eloquently said, there is a lot of our students actually going to our guidance counselors, so thinking about whether that's an option.
Yeah, and I certainly, and when, with all the city departments we're talking about, I recognize that there's a lot going on already, and that I don't want to overly burden, staff, but, this, making it easier, especially I think for our young people, to vote, because, can talk to, Sabino and Commissioner Irish about the demographics of the city electorate, which is often skews much older and often much whiter than the city as a whole. So I think anything we can do to make it easier, certainly for families in the system, the BPS system, who have a really, I would argue, one of the strongest interests in the future of our city government, and for their children who might not necessarily be able to vote yet. Is there anything about, Anthony was mentioning that him and some of his friends, given all their commitments, which is admirable, having a hard time finding time to vote. Obviously, especially, in high school or citywide population, getting back to your polling location could be tough if you have a club, if you're on a sports team. Is there anything that we can be talking about, and maybe this goes back to the elections department, and we don't have to have everyone just jump up here, but maybe food for thought of, obviously through the early voting process, but I mean, time off, is there something around that? I certainly would like to see employers mandated to give people time off to go vote on election day. Is that something that could be discussed, or maybe a later start time on election day? Obviously, our high school, the students who are eligible are not getting on the yellow buses. They're getting themselves to school, giving some time in the morning to make that possible, once every 2 years doesn't seem like too big of a burden.
Yeah, I think we can explore with our superintendent can explore with our school leaders and our school committee whether there are ways in which we can either start later or allow students to leave for that sort of thing. I think this idea of even providing students with their community service credits by doing that work is another great idea and another great incentive that can support our students.
Great. Well, thank you, and I appreciate the beginning of a conversation. Like I said before, looking at things we can do without legislation, such as including voter registration information in the BPS welcome packets, and making sure that families, whether they're new to the city or just otherwise unregistered, are able to do that. Again, I think there's a lot that can be done here through administrative policies that don't require significant resources and don't require changes to the law. Obviously, we're talking about, same-day registration, automatic registration. Those we're going to have to go to the State House and deal with through the home rule process, but it's good to hear about these opportunities, and I'm certainly glad to hear you all, like the prior departments, being open to this. I appreciate it, and Anthony, thank you for sharing your perspective. It's helpful. I think really want to make sure not just people who just turned 18, but certainly our younger population. And in this context, I define younger as anyone under 45 to make it easier to vote. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Moving right along.
Hi everybody, my name is Carla Tankle and I'm the Constituent Relations Manager of the Boston Transportation Department. Commissioner Fiandaca had a previous engagement, so she asked me to attend. Councillor Zachem, thank you for having us. I had a quick conversation with the Commissioner today, and we're definitely open and willing to have a conversation about the voter registration. I know there was some conversation about our resident parking program, and it's definitely something we could look at to see if there is a possibility to add that option into the procedures that we have now. So
Great, well, that's a good start.
that is a good start.
I will say, I mean, doing it myself and hearing from constituents and friends, getting your resident parking permit is one of the more arduous and document-intensive processes in the city, and that's not meant as a criticism. Certainly want to make sure that our precious resident spaces, particularly in my district, go to residents. But it does seem like the most natural fit for when folks are, I think absent the citizenship question, you guys are already doing everything else.
Right,
And,
exactly.
And I want to be conscious of the fact that given the climate around citizenship and documentation, that we don't deter people from engaging with the city, but I think, the transportation department, I think especially when it comes to some of our younger residents, whether it's they're getting their first car, or whether they're coming here for school, or just graduating school and coming here for work, having that interaction. So I think this might be a bit more involved than just saying, here's the voter registration card.
Right.
I think in working with the elections department to say, you don't have to go also to the other window to register.
Right, no, so we would definitely have to work under the direction of the elections department and have a conversation with them on how they would, because I know they're right next door.
Right.
I do know that every 2 years when the resident parking program is coming up for renewal, the elections department does have someone out, asking people to sign up while they're waiting in line, so that's a
Right.
really good
I did not know that.
step
That's
in
good.
in the direction, yes.
And, yeah, no, and it seems to me that so many people, do you have an estimate, and if it's just an estimate, that's fine, of how many folks get new resident permits annually?
I don't know. I don't
But
know.
safe to say it's
It's a lot.
in the thousands?
Yeah, oh
probably.
yes,
Yeah,
for sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And we had, how many people voted the other day, 50,000? 58,000. So, that's, I'm sure some of them are already registered, but that's, a big number to talk
Right.
about. So I guess I don't know if it's not really a question at this point, but as far as, BTD goes, I think an ideal outcome would be that when folks are registering for their resident permit, they are going to be registered to vote unless they say, I don't want to register to vote. I think
Right.
that would be sort of an ideal outcome, and I think we'll explore further, whether that requires legislation or just cooperation between the two city departments.
Yeah, we're
Um,
certainly open and willing to listen to that.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. I don't have
Okay,
anything
you,
else
Counselor.
at this time. Thank you.
you're welcome.
I believe that's all the city departments that we had here. And now we have Josh Young, I think from ABCD, is here, and I'm going to welcome you down and take this opportunity to thank ABCD for working with us and many of the other activists in this room on this issue, on pushing always to lower these barriers to voting. And I'd love to hear your views on what's already been said and any other suggestions, and obviously if you have an opening statement to deliver that as well.
Sure. Thank you, Councilor Zakim. I'm Josh Young, and I'm the Director of Legislative Affairs at Action for Boston Community Development, which is Boston's official anti-poverty agency. We at ABCD have long held that the 20-day voter registration deadline is an instrument of disenfranchising thousands of residents, particularly low-income residents and people of color, as a form of subtle voter suppression. We continue to urge our legislators at the state level to take action by rejecting the 20-day voter registration law and endorse same-day, election day voter registration. This summer, in the Chelsea Collaborative versus Galvin case, the case argued that 4,403 Boston voters were not able to participate in the 2016 presidential primary. And because they registered 20 days, they did not reach the 20 days before Election Day. And the Supreme Court agreed by striking down the law as not in keeping with Massachusetts Constitution. We would like to see voter registration as an option in both Boston and across the state. Our experience has shown that residents who cannot afford to stay stable in their long-term long-term residences are at a disadvantage. Add to that isolation, lack of education, technology, and lack of convenience are all factors that put them at a disadvantage when it comes to electing our leaders and voting for laws that would impact their lives. In Boston, during the 2016 presidential primary, neighborhoods with predominantly low-income residents and citizens of color, Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester, saw a large decrease in voter turnout. Meanwhile, the voter turnout increased in more affluent neighborhoods in the city. And according to the Commonwealth Magazine November 29th edition, indicated that only 65% of registered voters participated in the 2016 last presidential election. So evidence has shown that across the country, in the 15 states that currently have same-day voter registration, that there has been no instances of voter fraud, particularly when those places have put safeguards in place to prevent them. And we certainly would like to join our New England neighbors of Connecticut, Maine, and New Hampshire in implementing same-day voter registration. So thank you again for having us today.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for your advocacy, your partnership on this. I think you hit the nail on the head that the populations that end up being disenfranchised by these arbitrary rules are some of the folks whose voices need to be heard the loudest in our society. So certainly, I think the 20-day cutoff needs to be changed, and I would look forward to hopefully having the legislature act on that, but if not, a court decision to remove that and make it easier. Have you found that in, obviously we have some surrounding states that have same-day registration. Have you seen data that turnouts increased?
We have we have seen in some of the studies that we've looked at that voter registration has increased, particularly in areas where there are working families or lower income individuals. So, for instance, places like Claremont, New Hampshire, it comes to mind where they've done a study that showed voter participation increased dramatically by having a same-day election day voter registration.
And in the absence of same-day registration, which I acknowledge that we would need state action on, what are your thoughts, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, so feel free to defer this, on some of the things we've talked about earlier tonight about other touch points that the public has with city officials. Have you seen that in other places? Does that make sense?
I think we're welcome to work with you on advocating for tools to increase voter registration. Certainly, what we find with working with Mass Vote around the last go-around of voter registration and voter empowerment law that led to the early voting and the pre-registration in the high school, which my daughter has signed up for. That communication is the tool that most benefits residents across the city, particularly those of low income. We certainly try to make as much communication and tools available to the over 105,000 folks who walk through our doors every year. But again, it's persistent, consistent communication that will get the point across. Because, as I think was stated earlier, if it's a one-time deal, somebody might pick up the package and then forget about it. Right. So it has to be reinforced.
And as far as, are you aware of any states that require time off, paid or unpaid, from employers for folks to vote?
I'm not sure of that, Counselor, but we can definitely look at that and get back to you.
Because it seems to me, and this is, whether it's middle-class people, working class, or even affluent folks,
Right.
Sometimes have
Well, I
a hard
certainly have
time.
friends in other countries who have utilized the time off or actual holiday for
Right.
voting that seems to work for them pretty well. But I don't know of it in any other state, and would be glad to look at that.
No, that's certainly something I would be interested in exploring as well. Certainly same-day registration. automatic registration, but requiring, and like I said, paid or unpaid, but time off for folks to vote, talking about it for some of our students.
I think I can speak for my president and CEO and John Druitt, saying we would be glad to climb onto that platform of giving people time off in order to vote.
Great, excellent. Well, thank you for that.
Thank you, Council.
And that concludes our formal program. Unless I'm missing anyone, no? Okay. And now I know folks who have signed in and indicated they would like to testify. I'm going to call your name. If you just sort of follow the same procedure, come on up, state your name, any affiliation, and we'd like to obviously keep folks just to a couple minutes in the interest of everyone's time. But certainly if I have questions, I may ask them. I may wait till later. And we're going to start with Pam Wilmot.
Thank you, Counselor, and thank you for convening this hearing. My name is Pam Wilmot, and I'm Executive Director of Common Cause Massachusetts. We're a state chapter of a national organization founded in 1970 to advocate for open, accountable, and honest government and free and fair elections. So I am also a resident of Jamaica Plain and have been for many, many years. My kids are in Boston Public Schools. In fact, where did he go? The Mary Lyons School. I'm missing curriculum night right now. Anyway, I'm here to testify about the kinds of things that you might want to think about regarding voter registration. Election reform is an issue that Common Cause has been working for many years. In fact, although our colleagues at MassVote would mention many times, I actually wrote the legislation that passed regarding pre-registration, and have been advocating with the city on early voting for many, many years. I also want to commend Commissioner Irish on the early voting procedures that were in the last election. One of the things, as he mentioned earlier, is that there are limited things that you can do as a city because our election laws are set at the state level. There is discretion in certain areas of the law, and then you can obviously use your city services the way that you want to. So for early voting, the state gave a lot of discretion to municipalities about how they wanted to implement it. There was a certain threshold, but then municipalities were free to go beyond that. And for the city of Boston, if you had adhered just to the minimum, it really would not have worked at all. That would have only been 9 to 5 in City Hall. We have way too many residents in the city of Boston for that to be a full implementation of the law. So I think the city did a fantastic job, and that's something that I think we want to continue and build on that experience. There is legislation being considered at the State House about expanding that at an optional basis. And if that's something that you want to do, that would be something to weigh in at the state level.
Pam, just quickly, so
Yep.
I just want to be clear for everyone, but early voting is only right now available in presidential years, is that correct? Or is it in every even
It's
year?
every 2 years
2
in
years,
the
okay.
general, but it is not the primaries.
Okay.
There is one thing that was also in that legislation, which is auditing of the results of elections, which is only in presidential elections. That's also something that I've been working on for many, many years. Now, that's also something that we're advocating for, to expand that, because, as we've seen, hacking into many, or trying to hack into many registration systems. We in Massachusetts have a fairly secure system, but more and more we're going to be looking at threats to the integrity of our voting system, and we need to have an audit process that makes sense.
Thank you.
But that's not what we're here for today. So I'd like to speak just generally about, particularly about one reform, which, although I think it isn't something that you do here in Boston, it is something that you can weigh in at the state level, and that is automatic voter registration. So automatic voter registration has been enacted in 10 different states, and it's a process by which state agencies who already are charged with voter registration, we passed a motor voter law, which meant the Department of Motor Vehicles and other social service and disability agencies had to offer voter registration as part of their services. And really only the registry is the only one that has integrated into the central voter registry an electronic process. All the rest hand you a paper form. So if you go to Mass Health and you fill out a 27-page form with I think it's 21 page, so, with 7 different questions on citizenship, and you provide them with all the other information, you still have to fill out a separate paper form for voter registration. It just doesn't make any sense. After you've done all that work, it's the last thing you want to do. We have the information. It should be integrated into the process, not just in the registry, but also in certain agencies like Mass Health and other voter registration agencies. Probably as they get a little bit ready. We don't need to do them all at once, but in states that have passed it, actually Oregon is the first that has fully implemented. They had, in the first 6 months, 230,000 new registrations. Wow. And 97,000 of those voted for the first time. Wow. So that is a lot of people in 6 months. Here in Massachusetts, we have 700,000 eligible citizens, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, that are not registered to vote. That is, the population of the city of Boston, more voters than we have in the city of Boston. That could be added to our rolls. And I think in Boston, we do have a particular interest in this because our population is more mobile than many other places in the country, in the state. And that is, so lower income, more mobile populations are really where this will help a lot because if you live in the same house for 30 years, you register once and you're done. But if you're somebody that, because of whatever reason, you need to move fairly frequently, then it is a big burden that doesn't need to be added, and it's completely unnecessary. We're in the 21st century. We have the information. Let's integrate it. Let's make it easy. Let's make it convenient for people and remove the barriers, actually. So we've also heard a lot about the 20-day waiting period. As you said, that is in litigation right now. I think that that will be heard, that court case will be heard sometime this winter, and hopefully it will decide, the Supreme Court, SJC will decide the same thing the Superior Court did, and will overturn the 20-day period. So at that point, it's up to the legislature to decide whether they're going to institute a new waiting period or do whatever, but I think there may be, we may be catching up very quickly for the next election. So that's one thing that we just need to be aware of as a city, is that we may be kind of shuffling at the last minute what our procedures are. So a few other things that were mentioned, I think, are good ideas around that the city can do. Pre-registration is a wonderful opportunity for our students, and to provide information to them about the process would really be helpful, both potentially in the curriculum, potentially in some other process that's integrated into their school day. An official part, as opposed to just having groups that come in and talk about it. Because it is part of really our civic education to learn about voting and what's open to them.
Great, thank you very much. Now have Jonathan Cohn.
Hi, my name's Jonathan Cohn. I'm a let me see if I can make this higher. I'm a resident of the Fenway. Kind of have been actively engaged on this issue through 2 different means. Let me see if I can make this. Maybe I can make this high.
You can hold it.
Okay, I'll just kneel. So I'm the co-chair of the Issues Committee with Progressive Massachusetts, a statewide grassroots member-based advocacy group, and one of the core parts of our kind of progressive platform for the state is good government and strong democracy, and expanding access to voting is a core part of that. I'm also the treasurer of the Ward 4 Democratic Committee here in Boston, and say again, thanks to Councilor Zakim for holding this hearing, and Councilor Zakim represents several of the precincts in Ward 4, and we've been recently more interested in seeing what we can do to increase turnout, increase engagement, particularly because a lot of the ward is very young, and one thing that you can see in the city is that turnout amongst the particularly younger precincts is always very low. So two kind of coincidences of dates that came to mind when thinking about voter registration in the city. One is the fact that Tuesday, which was our municipal preliminary election, was also National Voter Registration Day. And there's just kind of an unfortunate coincidence that on National Voter Registration Day, people couldn't register at the polls and vote in that same election. Because as others have noted, Massachusetts does not have election day registration, and indeed we're the only state in New England to not have some form of it. Since even Rhode Island doesn't have it fully, but they allow it, I believe, for presidential elections. So we kind of lag very much behind our peers. And it's a technology that states have had, that I think Minnesota and Wisconsin had back in the 70s, and New Hampshire in the 90s. So in a way, it's just bringing elections back up to like 20th century levels of technology. Then there's also the fact that as Pam Wilmot from Common Cause noted, Boston is a very mobile city. And I can't remember the exact percentage off the top of my head, but if you live in Alston, Brighton, Fenway, or even many other parts of the city, you realize how many people move on September 1st. It is kind of a huge from the perspective of logistics for the city for that. And considering how often our preliminary and primary elections are in September, the fact that so many people change their address on September 1st and need to register in 20 days advance is effectively a form of disenfranchisement of all of those people. So that just simply by moving, you will be unable to vote, especially because even if you may have a grace period where you can vote at your old address, it may no longer be any remotely convenient for you to do so. And both kind of the legislative reforms discussed would help to address that, since I know one of the first things that I did when I moved was update my license and making to build in voter registration into that process. So it's something that once you do the things that you do when you move, it's already a part of that, and you don't have to take an additional step, as well as to allow people to register at the polls so that they don't lose that right to vote when moving in. One other thing that the city could consider that other cities have done would be I know Seattle passed an ordinance, I believe earlier this year, would be to require landlords to provide voter registration information to tenants. That's, again, considering how many people do move on September 1st, and there are already documents that landlords are required to provide tenants as part of a package, that can easily just be one more thing added to that, and kind of a good practice of encouraging civic engagement. One thing that I'd be happy to add, I don't have them on me, but in terms of studies that show the impact of both of some of the reforms discussed, that the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, last year did a study of the impacts of different types of voting reforms. And same-day registration had one of the most significant impacts. I believe about a turnout increase of about 5 to 7% from the different studies that actually tracked the percentage that it showed. And as Pam Wilmot from Common Cause noted, that automatic voter registration had a lot of success in its first kind of implementation in Oregon, and particularly in expanding the electorate and making the electorate more representative of the population itself. Since those who registered via automatic voter registration were younger, lower in income, and more ethnically diverse than those who registered by traditional means. And kind of expanding the electorate and making it more representative of the population as a whole is important, since if you're not on the voter rolls, politicians are often not, they don't see you for the most part, because if you are campaigning, you will be looking at a list of people that you see and with these addresses, et cetera. If you don't have up-to-date information, they're not going to be reaching out and asking for your vote. And so to make sure that you do have that basis of those people who are being asked questions about what they want to see in the city and wanting to be involved includes as many people as possible. It's important just to make sure that the city can work best for all of its residents. So yeah, and again, thank you so much for holding this hearing,
Thank you very much.
and for all the
Appreciate
other
it.
speakers as well.
And I think our last person who sent is David Vieira, if you'd like to come up and grab a mic.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Vieira. I live in Hyde Park. I served on the Boston Election Commission from 1999 to 2001. So I've been on the other side of the desk on issues like this. My opinions are personal. I do not represent any organization. I think a 20-day waiting period is acceptable for registering to vote, and I'll tell you why. It gives the election department a chance to cross-check to see if you're on the residency list, to notify your prior place of residence if it's outside the city, that you have registered, re-registered in Boston, and to ask that other municipality or state to take you off their voter lists. So let's use as an example a student that moves into Boston on September 1st. And what I'm about to say is pretty much reflective of presidential elections only. If a student can register and vote on the same day in Massachusetts, that also gives them the opportunity, if they are so inclined, to have asked for and received an absentee ballot from their home state and voted in that state. We owe it to the people to make sure that these things aren't happening. There was an incident a few months ago where a number of people who had gotten licenses illegally registered to vote in the city of Boston. The Secretary of the Commonwealth checked, and those people did not indeed vote in the city of Boston, but they could have. The integrity of the ballot is more important than the convenience of a person. These voter registration forms are available in many different places. I served for 15 years as the president of the Friends of the Library in Copley Square, and there were always mail-in voter registration forms available at the library. It's just a matter of whether you care enough to fill out the form and put it in the mail. It's not hard. I will also address a couple of things from a couple of the previous speakers. The gentleman from ABCD referenced the fact that in certain neighborhoods of the city, the voter turnout in the presidential election was lower in 2016. But let's be fair and reasonable. The reason why voter turnout was higher in the two previous elections was because Barack Obama was the candidate. This is, just something that has to be observed as a reasonable reason why things might have fluctuated. And another thing that has not been mentioned today is, well, let me go back a little bit. The absentee voter rules in this state stink. Before I became election commissioner, I served for 15 years as a warden in a precinct, and I could not file an absentee ballot because I was working for the city of Boston, because the rules are, well, you're not absentee, you're here. Early voting is good, but not the only solution. We need to be able to implement, I would like to see implemented a vote by mail process that applies to every citizen, whether they are sitting in their easy chair in Hyde Park or whether they are touring in Africa or South America. Mail in your ballot, have it done. I understand that Oregon has converted to an all-mail ballot.
Right.
And I can't see any possible reason why that shouldn't happen here. As far as turnout goes, folks, people who are interested in the process and want to get out and vote will find a way to get out and vote. And those people that come up with the excuse, oh, I didn't know it was election day, I don't find that a plausible reason to not vote. Sorry. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions, sir?
No, thank you, David. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much.
You are the last person who signed in to testify, but if anyone who is here would like to make any sort of comment, hold it open. No? No hands? No one's jumping up? All right. I want to thank everyone for being here and participating. Our representatives from the city departments, thank you for your engagement, and I would say it's not a surprise, but it's a pleasant, somewhat of a change from some other hearings, with everyone being on the same page and eager to make some changes here. I think it's really important. I think it's nice to see that there are some things that we can probably do through better planning and through engagement across departments that can make a difference here. Obviously, there are some legislative solutions to consider, both, I think, through the home rule process, just for the city of Boston, and through ordinances. I want to also make sure to thank Boston University and Ken Ryan, who's been sitting in the back, for arranging the space for us today, hosting us, and also for hosting at least one polling location that is in my district, over on Bay State Road, we used earlier this week. It's appreciated. I want to thank the city council. Two. Sorry, you guys have two locations. Only one in my district, I guess, that I'm going to. But one must be in 21. So thank you for that and for hosting us tonight. I want to thank our central staff for being here and for setting everything up, and my team for helping put this together. Thank you all. With that, I will now formally adjourn this hearing on docket 1061. Everyone have a good evening.
Con la pingue